Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Opposing the American War in Vietnam. I'm Chris Appy, Director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Tonight's discussion is the second of four events in a series called Reckoning and Reconciliation, the Conference on the Vietnam War and its Legacies to mark the 50th anniversary of the war's end. These four events explore crucial questions about the war's causes, conduct, and consequences. The next webinar is in 2 days, Thursday, April 17th, also at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It'll be a discussion of the war's legacies in both Vietnam and the United States in steps toward reconciliation. As a capstone event on April 30th, the exact 50th anniversary of the war's end, we are delighted to host in person at UMass a reading and talk by the acclaimed Vietnamese novelist and poet Nguyen Phan Quay Mai. She's the author of The Mountains Sing, Dust Child, and many others. For more information and recordings of prior events, please go to our website, eipad.org. The Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy is inspired by Daniel Ellsberg, whose voluminous papers are housed in the Robert Cox Special Collections and University Archives at UMass. As most of you know, Ellsberg was a government official in the 1960s who supported the Vietnam War before turning radically against it. His opposition led him in 1971 to release to the press and public a 7,000-page secret history of the Vietnam War, the so-called Pentagon Papers, that exposed decades of government lies and deceit about the causes and conduct of the war. Ellsberg's political conversion from hawk to dove is one of the most dramatic of the Vietnam era because no official with his access to power and privileged information risked so much, a possible life in prison, to overturn the policies he had once supported. But as we will discuss tonight, many millions of Americans changed their mind, sometimes quite profoundly, about the necessity and justice of the US war in Vietnam. I will be the moderator of tonight's discussion, and I encourage those of you listening to submit questions in the Q&A box. And in the final half hour of our program, I'll try to ask as many of those as possible. So I'm delighted to introduce our four panelists: Carolyn Eisenberg, Nguyen, William Short, and Penny Lewis. Carolyn Eisenberg, whose nickname is Rusty, and because she's an old friend, I'll probably refer to her as that, is a professor of U.S. history and American foreign policy at Hofstra University. Her most recent book, Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, was awarded the 2024 Bancroft Prize in American History, the most prestigious prize conferred by the historical profession in that field. Rusty was also a co-founder of Brooklyn for Peace and is presently the legislative co-coordinator for Historians for Peace and Democracy. Nguyen is an assistant professor of history at the University of Alaska Southeast. She completed her first BA in International Relations at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and her second BA in journalism in Vietnam's Academy for Journalism and Communication. She earned her MA at the University of Oregon on a Fulbright scholarship in 2010 and obtained her PhD at American University in 2019. Her research interests include the Vietnam War, U.S. foreign relations, imperialism and decolonization, and gender politics. Her book on the transnational movement against the Vietnam War, focusing on the role of the Vietnamese, is under contract at Cornell University Press. William Short is a Vietnam combat veteran, an artist, photographer, and educator based in Los Angeles. He is co-author with journalist Willa Seidenberg of the book A Matter of Conscience, GI Resistance During the Vietnam War. He was an associate director of the Indochina Arts Project at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. He was also an associate producer of the exceptional documentary Sir No Sir about the anti-war movement among active duty US troops, and a major contributor to the international exhibition and book on the same subject called Waging Peace in Vietnam. He has been a commentator for National Public Radio, and his photographs have been exhibited throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. Penny Lewis is Professor Lewis studies social class, social movements, and urban social change. Her books include, and most relevant to tonight's discussion, the book called Hard Hats, Hippies, and Hawks, the Vietnam Anti-War Movement as Myth and Memory, and several other books. One, The City is the Factory, New Solidarities and Spatial Strategies in an Urban Age, Immigration Matters, Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future, and A People's Guide to New York City. She has worked as a union organizer and has been active in various labor and community organizations. She currently serves as vice president for senior colleges at the Professional Staff Congress, CUNY's Faculty and Staff Union. So I'd like to begin tonight's discussion by going around and asking each of our guests to say a few personal words about how they became engaged, either both directly and indirectly, with the anti-Vietnam War movement and why that continues to be a serious concern of yours. So let's start with Carolyn Eisenberg.
Thank you, Chris, and it's really a pleasure to be with everybody. We're talking to each other before, and we're all happy to be chatting, whatever. And thank you for, grateful that the Ellsberg Institute actually exists. So, question of how did I get involved? I'm so old that I can remember that as a freshman at the University of Chicago, somebody came who was from Quakers to tell us that the U.S. was waging war in Vietnam and to tell us about something called strategic hamlets. And nobody believed this. Everybody said, how can there be a war? We don't know about it. And what about strategic hamlets? We never heard of that either. So that tells you something about the times. And, after that, of course, it became clear there was a war. And at my university, as across the country, people became increasingly active. And then as a graduate student at Columbia, I was actually a participant on the steering committee for 1968 takeover. And actually, by reflection, Columbia back then was far more benign than it is today. So I have a sort of a history of activism, but for those of us who were activists back then, watching the situation in Israel-Palestine, it brings back a lot of familiar emotions. The sheer horror that our government was the cause of so much human suffering, especially of civilians, a sense of urgency about changing the policy. All of this accompanied by a sense that nothing was working, that no matter how many people, how many events, how much militancy was displayed, the policy didn't seem to be getting better. And unfortunately, in subsequent decades, that sense of futility has been amplified by historians, some mainstream, some from the left, that suggest that nothing that the anti-war movement did actually altered the policy in any significant way. If the Vietnam War ended, it was for, altogether other reasons. And so, but when I began my book on Nixon and Kissinger, that was not the first thing on my mind. What was on my mind was that I was teaching this course, and my students kept insisting that everything they read, nothing explained Nixon and Kissinger. And they thought everything they were reading was useless. It didn't make any sense. Why didn't he just get out of the war? And that was it. And they said that so many times that I started to write little things, and then the little things became bigger things. And now they're, very long things. But that's really what it came from. It's really the conversations that we had in my class. So I didn't actually start out writing a book about the peace movement. I was really trying to answer all these skeptics in my class in some knowledgeable way. But as I was reading through more declassified Nixon documents that any human being should ever read again, One of the things that I got much clearer about was really that the anti-war movement had a tremendous effect on policy. And indeed, it had a tremendous effect even before Nixon came in the latter months of the Johnson administration. So I hadn't set out to make that particular point, and it's, part of a larger study, but I think that's an abiding impression I have that protest really can work, and that's something I wish I could convey to my students who are struggling right now. But anyway, I think that's a summary.
Thanks, Rusty. Let's turn to Wit now.
Um, Hi, yeah, this is really a great pleasure to be here. For me, I keep, when I heard the question, I kept thinking about a saying I heard a long time ago that, it's not really the I chose the subject, but the subject chose me. So when I came to this country to do my master's at the University of Oregon, I was doing communication. But then I found myself talking about the war all the time. And the more disturbing thing was that I was not able to answer a lot of the questions that people asked me. I came from, I was born and raised in Vietnam. I received the education there, things that I considered, no-brainer. People would not see it that way. Sometimes they would say things to me, then I would get upset, but I didn't know why I was upset. And I thought it was wrong. I didn't know why it was wrong about the war, for example, their assessments, or their thoughts or feelings, or their understanding of the war. So I realized by the end of my master's degree that I'm not going to escape this. I will have to understand this war. I realized by then how much my identity was shaped by this war. I would not be able to move on without understanding it. Now that I would look back at, my grandparents' stories, my parents' stories, I would look at my upbringing, my town in a totally different way. And I really wanted to understand all of that, to piece them together, at least to make sense in my head, so that I have a coherent way moving forward, how to process the things that people say to me, how to say things to people, in ways that would facilitate, mutual understanding. So that's why I've been doing it for 14 years now. And it chose me for sure.
Thanks, Wit. Let's turn to Bill Short. You're going to unmute yourself, Bill.
Hi, I was a combat platoon leader in Vietnam in 1969. And after 4 months of combat, myself, my first squad leader, and the platoon sniper, the three of us went on strike against the war. Since I was the senior NCO, I was initially charged with leading a conspiracy to mutiny against the United States government. The other two guys got worried about the amount of prison time they were going to get, so they went back out to the field, and I was left standing alone. I was finally charged with disobeying a direct order, which was an order to go to the field to fight. I was court-martialed twice and sent to a U.S. Army stockade in Vietnam, Long Binh jail, twice. I tried to bury all of that for 10 years. And then when I finally went back to school in the late 70s, early 80s, and finished my undergraduate master's degree as an artist, all of that experience started percolating back up in my work. So I became very involved with veterans organizations like the Smedley Butler Brigade in Boston, and a lot of my work ended up revolving around my Vietnam experience. Currently, my wife and I are producing a podcast based on the book that we published, A Matter of Conscience, GI Resistance, during the Vietnam War. And I'd like to play a short trailer of that right now, if I could. So I'm going to share my screen. It's only 3 minutes long.
Come on, come on, child. You got yourself in a terrible jam. Way down here, Vietnam. So put down your books and pick up a gun. Wanna have a whole lot of fun.
I'm Bill Short. In 1969, I was an infantry platoon sergeant fighting in South Vietnam. After 4 months of combat, I went on strike against the war with 2 of my fellow platoon members. I was court-martialed twice and sent to a military stockade in Vietnam. Little did I know at the time, I was part of a growing GI anti-war movement.
And I'm Willa Eisenberg. I was a high school student in the early 1970s demonstrating against the war. Until I met Bill, I had no idea so many soldiers opposed the war.
I got there in May, and by August, I was very clearly against the war. Because I felt that we were wasting American lives and Vietnamese lives pointlessly.
GIs in uniform took individual and collective acts of dissent against the war. And by 1971, an Army colonel declared that the U.S. military was on the brink of collapse.
I do believe passive resistance is probably a very significant factor in the inability of the military to continue its mission.
I went to the stockade, and it was all these black people, man, all these brothers, man. That blew my mind.
GIs refused to go to Vietnam, deserted from the military, organized GI anti-war coffee houses, and published some 300 underground newspapers.
We chose the name Rage. I mean, the content was pretty full of rage.
15 years after the war ended, we traveled the country interviewing and photographing 58 former GI resistors. These stories became an exhibition and a book called A Matter of Conscience, GI Resistance During the Vietnam War.
And in 2025, you can hear their voices in a podcast to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of the war.
I was in Vietnam the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. It was maybe a week straight after that. You couldn't get a black soldier to go on patrol.
The stories of these anti-war GIs bear witness to the difficult choices soldiers are forced to make in an unjust war.
I really had this overwhelming sense of injustice and immorality of what our country has stood for.
The Presidio mutiny and sitting down and singing We Shall Overcome is like the high point in my life. In some ways, it changed my life.
To donate to the podcast and for more information, visit amatterofconscience.com.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
See, how do I get back to the main screen here?
Well,
are we back on
yeah, looks good. Okay, let's turn to Penny Lewis.
Hi, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you. And Bill, that the timeliness of your podcast is really strongly felt. I'm really glad that that's coming out right now. So Chris, thank you. And thanks to the Ellsberg Initiative for hosting this. I first got involved with the Vietnam anti-war movement by being an activist in the anti-Iraq war and anti-Afghanistan war movement, which I was active in as a graduate student. But I was also there representing my union. So in the first weeks after 9/11, a group got started here in New York City called New York City Labor Against War. And so myself and a lot of my, union siblings got active in New York City Labor Against War. We had a lot of conversations within the city university system about trying to organize our opposition to the wars. We took that activism and organizing to the American Federation of Teachers and helped with a lot of other locals pass an anti-war resolution within the AFT. And then eventually we went on to, we and many, many, many other people went on to form the U.S. Labor Against War Initiative, which brought the AFL-CIO to taking an anti-war position, which, if anyone is familiar with the Vietnam anti-war movement, is a pretty tremendous turnaround for the National Federation of Unions in the United States. And so it was within that work that I got to know many fellow activists who had been active in the Vietnam anti-war movement, and some of them through their unions, some of them as high school students, Bill, like your partner, and some like as veterans and GIs. And that last really resonated with me because I have family, many veterans in my family, and I grew up very close to the VA hospital here in New York and worked with a lot of anti-war veterans in a community garden when I was growing up. And so this set of stories that I started to hear as a graduate student opened my eyes to a different Vietnam anti-war movement than the one that I had heard about, because I had heard that the Vietnam anti-war movement, or my sense of it, and I tried to study history, but my sense of it was that it was very much rooted on the campuses, and even the movement that I was participating in at the time in the early 2000s, it would be compared to the Vietnam anti-war movement, and they would say things like, "This isn't your father's anti-war movement." Like today we don't have this situation where it's the crazy liberal elitists against the good workers of America, because today we have good workers of America, part of the anti-war movement. But I was hearing this story that even during the Vietnam anti-war movement, many working class people, a very broad section of the United States, participated in the anti-war movement. And so that set of stories and experiences that I was very lucky to hear from, my fellow unionists and my movement comrades brought me to study this as my dissertation project. And that project eventually became the book, Hard Hats, Hippies, and Hawks. And that book tells both, tries to perform a historical study of the class dynamics of the Vietnam anti-war movement, looking at the opposition in working class communities and the vectors through which working class folks participated in the war, and the diverse ways in which the mainstream movement dealt with issues of class. But it also wants to provide a theoretical accounting of why we have this memory, why the memory of crazy liberal elitists and the memory of a very narrow anti-war movement persists. And so that set of questions is what motivated me to write the book. And I'll say that in the years since then, that set of questions motivates a lot of my other work, which has taken me away from the Vietnam anti-war movement, but continues to drive me towards understanding social class dynamics and effective movement building in the United States.
Thanks, Penny. I am going to want to follow up with each of you and get more detail on some of your personal experiences, but let me first sort of pick up on a point that Penny was making. It seems to me that in the decades after the war, a very sort of pernicious stereotype of the anti-war movement came into being, which really greatly stereotyped the movement and reduced its size, its diversity, its moral seriousness, and led generations of students to believe that basically the anti-war movement was comprised of a bunch of sort of sanctimonious, possibly unpatriotic, draft dodging hippies who took their anger out on returning American veterans. Those kinds of images had a very prominent place in American culture. So my question is, do you agree with that assessment? Where did it come from? What political uses did it serve? And what would you want to put in place of those distorted images? What are some of the sort of more positive things we might say about the Vietnam era anti-war movement? I know that that's a lot, but maybe Carolyn, you could get us started on that.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I discovered when I was looking at the part of the Vietnam period that had to do with Cambodia. So there was Kent State. My initial thing was, well, okay, everybody talks about Kent State. Like, it's going to be really what, who needs me? It's going to be 5 minutes. But then when I started to ask questions and I interviewed some of the participants, what I realized was that Kent State, which often is caricatured as, another one of those examples of elitist kids from Long Island, I realized that that wasn't really true. And I mean, Kent State itself was a kind of school that had a lot of working class students. And that, for example, one of the pictures that was iconic, other than the young woman screaming, is a student running across the field with a black flag. And I interviewed him about why are you carrying that black flag? Like, what could that be about? And what he was describing to me was actually what he was, which is that he turned out to be living with a group of Vietnam vets off campus. And one of those vets had a brother that was in Vietnam who about 3 weeks before had been killed by I think by a tank that rolled backwards. And so that what left of the body came back to Ohio, and they had all gone to the memorial. Like this whole group of young men had gone, and they're furious, right? And several of the young men, I should say themselves, were veterans. So again, this wasn't just hippies from Long Island. And so they had all gone to this funeral, and they said to each other, when we are going to do something, we can't let this go. We have to take an action. And so he was making that point that that black flag was an expression of their rage. And, so that kind of conversation that I had just like made me much more curious about Kent State. And really, when you look at Kent State, it's a mixture of young people. I mean, yes, there were, definitely middle income people. I mean, a couple of people that were killed weren't even protesting, but they just happened to be standing around. But, that this was really not a middle class thing. It wasn't an elite development. And, that the presence of returned veterans on that particular campus had introduced a quality of seriousness and concern that, was kind of what you then saw, in the reaction to Cambodia. So that was just one example. And other people here on the panel can talk more knowledgeably, but I do quite a bit of work about, again, the dissent among veterans. And again, I really yield to others of you on that point, but again, that turned out, I mean, I knew them. We did know that there were vets explaining, people knew about the Winter Soldier hearings and so forth, but really didn't appreciate anywhere near the breadth of that dissent, especially as it developed, in those Nixon years in 69, 1970, 71, in that time period. So I think others have also seen this in their research, how broad it was. And I'm sorry, stick in one last thought because I'm thinking of Donald Trump. But it was very serviceable for people in power to describe this as a bunch of elitists and to see that there's a political payoff, right? And that had a very broad meaning, in fact. And of course, we're watching this right now, right? You see, Donald Trump is counting on the fact that people hate Harvard. And people, and those schools, and that he's gonna get a lot of political advantage from that. And I think Nixon had a very similar intuition.
Thanks, Rusty. That's helpful. And you remind me that I've talked to a number of vets who were very disturbed by the killings at Kent State. Right. People like Bill Earhart and Ron Kovic write about this. Bill, how about you jumping in? And just before you talk, let me remind viewers that you've probably heard this idea that veterans returning from Vietnam were kind of routinely, literally spat upon by anti-war activists. So as part of your answer, I wonder, Bill, if you could address that sort of common assumption in post-war memory.
Sure. I think Jerry Lemke's book, The Spitting Image, is a really good book to get more background on that mythology. There were times when, on a personal level, there might be suspicion about GIs, about why they even agreed to go to Vietnam. But I think in general, there is a strong camaraderie and strong collaboration between veterans returning from Vietnam and getting out of the service with the anti-war movement. I think that also that the inclusion of veterans in the anti-war movement was probably one of the key things that brought the war to a halt. By 1969, when I refused to go on combat operations, the anti-war movement inside the military was really starting to blossom and grow. And by 1970, you had whole units who were putting down their arms and refusing to fight, or at least going on strike for a day. So once veterans came back and got involved in the anti-war movement, I think that gave some of the people who were kind of on the fence about the war a reasonable excuse to join the anti-war movement, because they figured if GIs are coming back from the war and saying it's wrong, then there must be something really wrong about the situation. Also, when GIs came back from Vietnam, they kind of infected other GIs when they were posted at various military bases. Generally, when you served your year in Vietnam, you came back, you might have had 3 or 4 months or 6 months left of service. So you'd be sent to Fort Hood, Fort Dix, Fort Lewis to finish out your term. By 1971, the U.S. military were discharging GIs directly from service when they came back, because they realized that infection that the GIs coming back from Vietnam were infesting GIs stateside with was what was really driving the coffee houses, the GI newspapers, the general anti-war movement inside the military. So they decided that these guys coming back from Vietnam were dangerous, that they needed to be gotten rid of as quickly as possible, because they were bringing, anti-military ideas back from their experiences. I know we've interviewed a number of people who said that the stories that GIs were bringing back from Vietnam was what caused them to step over the line and refuse to go.
Thanks, Bill. The coffee houses he was alluding to were established on the outskirts of military bases by civilian anti-war activists with the explicit hope of making connections with active duty troops and give them a space where they can talk freely about the war and politics. Whit, I'd like to turn to you and say whatever you want, but in the back of my mind, I'd be curious for you maybe to say a few words about the activism of overseas Vietnamese and how that too helps to enlarge or refresh our memory of this incredibly vibrant, diverse anti-war movement.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think the Vietnamese had an advantage. The Vietnamese diaspora had an advantage in the anti-war movement at the time, because they had already had a long tradition of resistance during the French War. And so in France, they just continued to channel that energy into, the anti-war movement during the American War. And so that was, part of the reason why the movements in France and, in general in Europe was so strong, with the Vietnamese playing an important role in it. In the US, the number of anti-war Vietnamese was very small, very, very small. The anti-war movements in the US was pretty much entirely local based. But at the same time, the Vietnamese, helped with, with the presence of some Vietnamese in the anti-war movements, they gave the movement, a face and a voice, helped to personalize the message. And so at least that's, what my research indicates. But still, my subjects, when I interviewed them, all the ones in the US always credited the anti-wolf movements. They even said that, they learned from them. They were elevated by them. They were protected by them. And so yeah, they were pretty humble in their assessments. One thing they said that was stuck to me, and maybe that's also relevant to our discussion later. They said, they kept telling me, of course, they were grateful for their members in the American members in the anti-war movement, but they also said that they didn't want to take too much credit because what they did was nothing compared to what the Vietnamese in Vietnam had to endure. And so they said, well, the FBI was pursuing us, we may lose the scholarship, we may get harassed here and there, but compared to the people, our Vietnamese, fellow Vietnamese in Vietnam being bombed, being shot at, being, facing death every day, what we were doing was really nothing. So I think the reason why I brought this up, I think, is because it really goes to the heart of our question nowadays about, movements, peace movements. Is that I wonder if the movements, the Vietnam War, the anti-Vietnam War movements got so large, it was because of all the bloodshed, enough blood had to shed for people to realize and to rise and to band together and do something about it. And so I don't have an answer. It was just a thought.
Thanks so much. Penny, again, you can answer however you want, but just to remind people, you're the author of a book called Hard Hats, Hippies, and Hawks. Maybe you could say something about where this image of the hard hats as a kind of figure, a symbol of kind of a working class hawk, who loathed anti-war protesters, how that convinced a lot of people that working people and lower income people were more in favor of the war, more supportive of the war, part of Nixon's sort of silent majority. How that image formed, and how you would kind of take it apart.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, your question is kind of like, I'm like, well, my whole book. That's what my book's about. Yeah. So the image of the hard hat hawk comes from a protest that took place right after the Kent State massacre that Rusty was talking about. So in May 1970, when a number of young anti-war activists went down and stood outside a federal hall on Wall Street in a silent, peaceful protest against the war. I think this was like May 8th, 1970. And a number of construction workers who were actually working on building the World Trade Center nearby had been encouraged by their foreman to go and confront this anti-war group. And they were joined by a lot of Wall Street workers, like kind of stockbroker bro types, and confronted the anti-war protesters. And it turned into this kind of melee, where they were beating on protesters. They marched uptown. They were beating up people who looked like hippies or, protesters along the way. And in the weeks that followed, Richard Nixon came to New York and put a hard hat on and, rallied with the workers, and the New York City Central Labor Council backed the workers. And so it looked like this authoritarian working class mob, was out to kill anti-war protesters. And I think there is some truth to that. Like there were some authoritarian, thuggish, people, like 200 people who participated in this. At that exact same time, a majority of unionists who were asked about the actions said that they were completely opposed to it and thought it was outrageous. Unions had been coming out against the war, and that accelerated in the years following the Hard Hat Rally, the Labor Leadership Assembly for Peace, and other groups got started and had deeper roots inside of the labor movement in the years following the Hard Hat riot, and a lot of the people involved in the Hard Hat riot, when talked to, and the people nearby, and even the people who said that they maybe supported it, what is uncovered, and I think this gets to what Rusty was talking about in terms of the kind of easy target that an elite makes, in this country, that people spoke to a deep degree of class, dislocation, of discomfort with the changes that the movement, and not just the anti-war movement, but the movements of the era represented. And so it would be expressive through anger at protesters, even from people who oppose the war, right? So I think there's a large kind of subtle thing happening, and the big picture is that most working class people opposed what the Hard Hats did and opposed the war, like by serious numbers. I mean, after 1968, the sentiment against the war in the United States, people with less education and with occupations that are associated with working class positions were more likely to oppose the war than middle class and highly educated people. That is just one of those facts that people do not take in and don't necessarily know or expect, but it's the truth from the polls that we understand. But what it looked like in the movement is very different. And I guess I would just say a couple of things to your original question, because I think other folks spoke to this, but I think it's important for today in terms of thinking about how the movement is depicted, because the scale of it, the anti-war consensus that developed in this country was deeply threatening. I mean, it's incredible to think the extent to which that war was opposed, and how much. I mean, Rusty, your work shows that the ways in which the movements helped stop the war. But even besides that, the movements helped shape U.S. foreign policy and the way that the United States carried out its foreign policy, obviously for decades, the way the military, is structured, the draft itself. I mean, there's so many ways in which, both the Vietnamese fighting in Vietnam and the U.S. anti-warriors at home, changed the way the United States does these things. And I would say specifically to the question of the VIs and the GIs and the vets, that, this story that being anti-war means being anti-soldier is one of the most pernicious of the myths, and the one that is constantly used against people. And I think that it was so untrue at the time. There's not a single, which again, and I think Bill, you spoke to this, it's not like there was absolute comfort between the movement and GIs, but it's a very effective story to divide people, right? To play into the kind of class and cultural gap that frequently, occurs between movement and soldier, and to exacerbate that. And so it's one that I think, we have to be very on guard against in our work.
Yeah, just to underline that a little bit, I've had students over the years who believed that the most shameful thing about the war was not the wreckage we visited upon Vietnam, nor even the fact that we lost the war, but the poor treatment received by returning soldiers and their minds. And that stays with us, this constant way in which the dominant forces in our political culture are instructing us to, thank people for their service and not question too much the wars they're being sent to fight. people have an image of the anti-war movement dominated by images of mass protests and marches and rallies, but it's obviously lots more is going on. And to sort of open that up a little bit, I'd like to suggest that one of the most important things social movements do is to educate people. And so, I would like to hear you talk a little bit about what are some of the ways in which the anti-war movement raised fundamental challenges to exposed the glaring contradictions between the official justifications of the war and the war front realities, and how, just to complicate a little further, how that education pushed Americans to think not just about the pragmatic concerns about the war's cost and winnability, but more serious fundamental questions about the war's justice and morality. It seems to me that all is a very, very important work that's being done in the movement. So anyone want to sort of take on part of that anyway to get us going?
I could start with what was happening in the military.
Sure.
The way GIs educated themselves primarily was word of mouth, and stories that they kind of oral histories that they would tell each other about what it was like to be in Vietnam. The GI newspapers, for instance, were a great way to disseminate information throughout all the military bases around the country. Soldiers running coffee, working with the civilians, working in coffee houses. Most of it was in the military. Most of the military at that time were working class, because a lot of people who could afford to go to college went to college primarily, in a lot of cases, to avoid the draft. And a lot of the guys that I served with were all working class. And I think some of the people who were most vocal against the war were soldiers who had enlisted out of a sense of patriotism, but realized how wrong everything was, and they felt ripped off. They felt like they'd been sold a bill of goods. So, for instance, there's one of our interviewees, Dave Klein, came back and became one of the most prominent activists in the anti-war movement when he returned, and it was primarily because he felt like he had been convinced and lied to and sold a bill of goods that caused him to enlist. So I think that at least in the military, it was rap sessions, communications, kind of informal communication that really started the internal workings of the anti-war movement in the Army and in the military in general. And then that leading into relationships with the civilian anti-war protesters, and then GIs returning back to college. I was at Ohio University in 1970 when Kent State happened, and Kent State was our sister school. So the first thing that just everybody did there was we got out on the streets and closed the campus down. So I think at least from my experience, my personal experience, a lot of it was word of mouth. It wasn't a very formal education, very informal.
Right. And just the experience of landing in a country where it's clear from day one that you're not being greeted as liberators or saviors of democracy, but as foreign occupiers and invaders, and that you're not there saving people, but destroying this land. Who else wants to jump in?
Can I just pop in there
Sure.
for a second? I mean, I think it's hard to deal with some of this in a general way because there's so many different variations among different groups of people. And I would say certainly by the Nixon period, I mean, I think an overwhelming thing on a national perspective really was the fact that thousands of Americans had died. And they were, right. I mean, that is really the dominant reality, more than what people were doing to the Vietnamese, which also was relevant. But the sense of, and this is where TED, of course, was very important, that, especially people being told all the time that the, end of the light of the end of the tunnel, the end of the light, so you just have a lot of American kids dying, and nothing seems to be accomplished. So that's like at one level. I think it was a little different in the universities. And one of the things I, as a professor, have a lot of trouble ever really articulating is the extent to which in the 1950s, how patriotic everybody was. That is really different than it is now. I mean, that if you went to school in the 1950s or early 60s, you were just inundated with what an amazing, moral, wonderful country we were, right? We beat Hitler. The Cold War was being portrayed in a very, this is the bad guys, we're the good guys, we liberate people, they kill people, that entire thing. But the extent to which for people who were growing up in that atmosphere, that was really serious about believing in our country in a way that I don't think is true now. And so, in an odd way, once information about Vietnam starts coming in, and I go back to that episode of this woman coming and talking about strategic Hamlets, and nobody believes her because we don't do that. But as people began to really appreciate what was taking place there, so many aspects of that. There's not like one thing, but generally the suffering that we were inflicting elsewhere, as that's getting through, there's actually almost a sharper reaction because it's like the things that you believed are sort of crumbling. And, I think that also has implications for, the distrust of authority in general, so that not only are the presidents liars and killing people and so forth, but you start really feeling that the grown-ups don't know what they're doing, right? University administrators are, lying to you and they're really stupid, so it has very wide-ranging things, but I think it has the root, oddly enough, with the fact of how much people believed in this country. And then what happens?
And I was just going to come in on that last point because, one of the earliest organized expressions against the war came out of the civil rights movement. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was one of the first organizations in the country to come out against the war. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party endorsed draft resistance as early as 1965. And the logic of it from the Black movement, and I'm going to quote one of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party flyers, said, and excuse the old language here, no Mississippi Negroes should be fighting in Vietnam for white man's freedom until all the Negro people are free in Mississippi. And we don't know anything about communism, socialism, and all that, but we do know that Negroes have caught hell right here under this American democracy. Like this story of, you can send troops to Vietnam, but you can't send troops to the South to support, desegregation and support the fight right here. Like immediately, the contradiction of what it, both using the patriotic ideals of what is this country all about, but also pointing to the ways in which the ideals that this country stood for were being completely eroded in Vietnam and not being enforced at home. I think that education process within the Black Power and Civil Rights movement, got started right away and sharpened, a kind of deep critique of the United States and helped, I think, open the door to a broader anti-imperialist movement. I mean, also the Black movement, its connections to international anti-colonial movements and the connections that were forged in the United States to Vietnam itself as being a freedom fight, right? And an anti-colonial struggle helped educate within both the Black movement and the student movement, had a kind of deeper structural education valence. And the one other thing I would just add is other parts of the movement, I think, did a kind of education work connecting the dots between other kinds of oppression and exploitation that people experienced at home and the fact of the war itself. So the labor movement put out in 1971, Labor for Peace had a book that they put out that was called A Rich Man's War and a Poor Man's Fight. And the book was all about, who are we fighting for and how is this war affecting the workers at home, right? Like, what is this doing for our paycheck, our families, our sons? So, I think what's amazing to me about the education within the war are the different streams and the different types of education, the different parts of the movement affected, over the course of it.
Thank you so much. And it reminds me of I would just refer anyone interested to Martin Luther King's great anti-war speech of 1967, where he makes so many connections between domestic realities and what's going on in Vietnam, describing the war as an enemy of the poor. We're fighting poor people, we're sending our own poor people to fight, and we're taking money away from resources that might address poverty at home and racism. Whit, do you want to add in to this?
Yeah. This is really rich, and thank you so much for all your contributions here. Yeah, that's a lot. So I would just come in on the Vietnamese side of what they did to expose this, disconnect. The government was trying to, sell this war to the public, and the Vietnamese were, with others in the global anti-war movements, tried to expose the disconnect here. So the first thing they did was the broken Geneva Accord agreements. So the promises. So they just kept hammering on that. You promised us this, you promised us that, you never did this, you never did that. So that's one of the things that they did, the messaging. And the other thing they did to expose, the disconnects here was a war crime. So they introduced a lot of they invited foreigners to Vietnam. They invited Americans to Vietnam. There was an entire apparatus, really intricate and complex apparatus to invite foreigners, especially Americans, to Vietnam, to North Vietnam, to witness at the later stage of the war. To the south, they did it in 1963, but not later. And so, and also they sent witnesses abroad, they sent delegations abroad. They also facilitated meetings abroad. Somebody in the chat mentioned Bratislava. They also went to Canada. They also went to, Indonesia. They went to anywhere and everywhere they could go to meet with, peace activists, any concerned citizens, anyone, anywhere, anytime that they could do it, they would do it. And they were tenacious in that endeavor. And the third thing that they were trying to do to expose this, deadly war, and to try try to get people to see how ridiculous it was the credibility argument, by showing, one of the arguments of the government was that we got to do it in Vietnam, otherwise, our credibility abroad is going to be, damaged. Our allies would not trust us, and so on. And so by fostering this global anti-war movements, to show that, no, you're not actually helping your credibility, global credibility, you're actually damaging it. It really, showed, people that, oh no, we're not very popular here. We're being opposed a lot. I mean, we as in the government. At the same time, the Vietnamese were also using this anti-war sentiments, the brewing and anti-war sentiments as it's like a chicken and egg thing. So they try to stoke up this global anti-war sentiment, but then they use the sentiments, the increased anti-war movement to feed their own morale, to decrease the morale of the other side, but to increase their own morale. Their people's is Nhân dân, the newspaper, the daily by the party, is called the Nhân dân. They had their own section. There are only 4 pages of that daily newspaper. They have one page, an entire page, called "The World is on our side. And so clearly that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to use, their own determination, their own tenacity, their own, everything to tell the world that we're gonna fight. But at the same time, they were using, the anti-war movements outside of Vietnam to tell people inside the country to keep fighting.
And they did with extraordinary fervor.
Yeah.
As many American soldiers found out firsthand. I have a question from someone in the audience. Melissa D'Addario happens to be the wonderful student intern for the Ellsberg Initiative. She's the one that makes all these fancy digital flyers that we send around. Her question is to Bill. She wants to know if you can describe a couple of specific incidents that you experienced in Vietnam that led you to make this very bold mutinous refusal to go into combat.
Well, I almost deserted and went to Canada. But because of my ties to my family and my family's history in this country, I couldn't bring myself to do that. I spent a night in a cheap hotel in Oakland. I spent a night before I reported for distribution to Vietnam, and I thought very hard about whether I was going to go or not. And I decided that I would go because I would go and if I thought that if the war was wrong, I was pretty certain that the war was wrong and I didn't want to serve in it. But I didn't have the strength, the nerve, or the political wherewithal to desert. So I think a lot of guys will tell you when you first get there, it's a real shock. I'd really never been much out of Ohio until I went to Vietnam, and the poverty, the destruction that I saw of the around the war was just overwhelming at times. Um, the fact that we were prosecuting the war and determining how successful the war was by body count, by counting the number of people that we had actually killed, seemed totally absurd to me. There was it's kind of hard to talk about, but there were a number of incidents that happened in the field that were just so shocking that I couldn't believe I was taking part in some of those kinds of things. In particular, there was an ambush that we blew, and another sergeant who was senior to me convinced me that we should booby trap the bodies with grenades. And being that close and that handling those bodies was something that was, I guess, really pushed me over the edge. I guess just the whole experience of it was just a surrealist nightmare. And almost every guy in my platoon, when myself and the other two guys refused to go on operations, we asked the other platoon members to go with us. But there were three reasons that the other platoon members said that would keep them in the field. And the first one was that they were afraid that their families would be dishonored and would disown them. Number two, they were afraid that they would never get a good job when they got back to the United States because they would have bad paper, bad discharge. And number three, they'd go to jail. Going to jail seemed to be the least of their concerns, but it was the social pressures that kept a lot of us in the field and doing the kinds of things that we were doing. I think I worked in what was called a free fire zone. So we didn't go to villages. We didn't really have direct contact with Vietnamese. If there was any action in the field, it was all combat. It was never checking IDs or that sort of thing. And I didn't really know Vietnamese. I didn't really have any idea about who the Vietnamese people were. But I think that in my case, it was absurdity piled up on absurdity, and I was already leaning toward being anti-war anyway, because I'd gone to Ohio University for a year and a half and got suspended for a semester because of my grades, and I got picked up in the draft during that suspension. So I was already aware that there was an anti-war movement. I was already leaning that way. But because of, like I said before, because of family pressures and family history, I, like a lot of other GIs, went to war very unwillingly. I hope that helps answer that because.
Thanks, Bill. We're getting a number of questions, hoping that we can connect the past to the present. One of them raises an interesting question. Tom Gardner asks, he points out that in 1968, a significant portion of the anti-war movement bowed out of the election, of electoral politics, and didn't see a significant difference between the Democrat Humphrey and the Republican Nixon. The question is, was that a mistake? And are we still feeling the effects of that move away from the electoral arena today?
I'd like to respond to that, if I may, about that whole question. You know, it's actually relevant about whether you're talking about the first half of 1968 or the second half, right? Because the first half, and this includes, of course, what happened in TAT, is that you had a lot of involvement in the electoral process, right? I mean, we started in a situation where Lyndon Johnson looked like a shoo-in, right? And then these anti-war people went to, to New Hampshire, clean for Gene, and had a humiliating result for Johnson, which then also, made Bobby Kennedy think he could become the president. And actually, my husband and I we went to Wisconsin to work in that primary, which was the follow-up. And that was really Johnson directly facing Eugene McCarthy. I don't think there's any way to overemphasize how many students went to Wisconsin. I mean, walking into the Milwaukee headquarters, it was like just floods of students and lots of people. And interestingly, because this bears on the class point, because of course these students had no place to stay. And interestingly, like the numbers of people in Wauwatosa who many of whom were lower middle class, working class people, who opened up their homes to these students was like a huge thing. And it was very clear that Johnson was going to get defeated. And I think we could see it. And I think his people told him that. So, why is that important? Because not only did it drive him out of the race, which was a good thing, but also it made him start to talk differently. No, we're not going to escalate. We're going to de-escalate. We're going to stop bombing. Most of the bombing we're doing in North Vietnam, we're going to try to get negotiations happening. So, I mean, I think all of those results were, were quite positive. I also just real quickly want to say that the distinction of like who did what in the anti-war movement, I think, is overdrawn. Like we and others of our friends went to Wisconsin and worked in electoral politics and then came back to Columbia and occupied buildings for the next, week. People were trying to do anything that seemed like it was going to work. I think the change that's implicit in that question is that in the second half of 1968, what happened was that the nominee became Hubert Humphrey. And so a lot of people who had initially gotten in because they wanted to get rid of Johnson, didn't find that a very exciting, activity. So, that's what I'm saying. I think if you're talking about withdrawal, it's much more striking, after the Chicago Convention, etc. I don't want to take up a huge amount of time, but I actually, from my research, I ended up feeling that electoral politics was much more important than we thought at the time. And that has to do with, number one, that Nixon looked at Lyndon Johnson and saw what happened to him, and that was going to shape his approach to the war. That was not a little thing. But also what was happening in Congress, which I could talk about more later, but the situation in Congress was much more oppositional than we necessarily realized, and it had a very big influence on the Nixon, White House. So I don't know if that tells us exactly what we should be doing right now. I think we should be doing a lot of things. And if I was going to sum up my final conclusion on this, it's that a lot of different things are helpful. That some of the argument of, oh, we should do this, oh, we should do that, and arguing about it, that there's a lot of different things that people do. You don't know what the results are right away, but many different things contributed, which I don't think I fully appreciated till I spent all the time in the archives and really saw how these things were really landing.
Thanks, Rusty. Anybody else want to weigh in on sort of the lessons of the anti-war movement that might be useful to people in the 21st century?
I didn't. I wanted to bring the government down. I didn't want to vote for anybody. And I think that in retrospect, that was a mistake. And I've never voted for somebody I really supported. I've always voted for the lesser of what I thought were two evils. There's never been a presidential candidate that I've actually fully embraced 100%. There's always been problems. But I think in this current atmosphere, you can't do that. You have to be involved with the political process the way it's defined. Working outside of it and trying to bring it down just doesn't work, I don't think. So I think the lesson for me was more political engagement in the conventional way, as well as working in unconventional ways.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is coming off of the last thing that Rusty said about, many approaches seem to work in that you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, being organized, being connected to other people. And it can be, I look at VVAW, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who organized around, jobs, who organized around mental health, who organized around veteran healthcare. I look at the Chicano moratorium, that organized around schooling, that also organized around jobs. Being deeply connected and organized with other people in organizations and pushing for what you want to win and finding some wins. Like, to me, that is what sustained people in the struggle. And it gives you the basis to take that organizing anywhere else. So I guess when I look back at the movement, I see people trying all different kinds of things. And I think it was it's hard to talk about when it was most successful and had the most failures. And it certainly had plenty of both. And on some level, the war, the war itself is such a almost impossible thing to end. It's such an on-off thing. Like, either the war is happening or the war is not. And it's happening. The decisions are at such a high level that the feeling of hopelessness that I think people can have, and, similar to the way I think a lot of people feel today, can be really profound. And yet people came at it from so many different angles. And when you could agree, when everybody, regardless of the tactics that you embraced, or regardless of whether or not you were electoral or direct action or multi-issue or single issue, there were so many moments when people put aside those differences and collectively engaged, some really brilliant mass mobilizations, the MOB, the 1969 moratorium, where in October, when 3 million people left work, had walkouts, that kind of mass action of people with many, many different tactical approaches and politics, I think created a situation of mass illegitimacy, that constrained the government.
If
So
I could just pick up on that, Penny, as Rusty was saying, you don't always know the effect of what you're doing. And that moratorium, which was really a kind of a national strike, because it was not on the weekend, it was the middle of the week. Nixon admits in his memoir that he pulled back from an ultimatum he had issued to Hanoi, saying that unless they made accommodations and negotiations, he would renew bombing, mine the harbors, maybe strike the dikes, even perhaps use nuclear weapons. He later regretted that he pulled back from that threat and thus invaded Cambodia and did other things to intensify and expand the war, but it did make a difference.
If I could come in on that, Chris,
Yeah.
I'm always a little skeptical about the nuclear weapons thing. I know Dan Ellsberg sort of emphasizes that, but what is clear from the record, it's not just in his memoirs, like there's piles and piles of documents. They are planning to escalate the war right then. I mean, Robert Levering has a very excellent film called The Movement and the Madmen. I think it's actually worth watching for anybody. And that film is really right. That's one of the cases where they really very specifically had decided that if the negotiations weren't going well, they were going to do something very dramatic. They were having a lot of trouble deciding what dramatic thing to do. So they're all fighting with each other, which is generating a lot of paper. But there is an understanding that you are going to escalate. And the moratorium really stopped them. I mean, they really that was it. That the idea that they could do something very dramatic and very mean and very hurtful, which they were up for, they really get rid. They see we can't do it now. It's just very clear. So that's, in general, in terms of what political action affects decisions, sometimes it's sort of diffuse. But in the case of the moratorium in particular, that's one of the places where it's very, very direct. And I think Robert Levering is right, to highlight that.
Also pressure from GIs refusing to go on combat operations too. The pressure for coming from GIs also, I think, accelerated the anti-war movement, and I think that you can't fight a war if you don't have soldiers willing to fight it. And Colonel Robert L. Heinel in 1971, in an article for the Armed Forces Journal, wrote about the collapse of the military, saying that the state of the armed forces in Vietnam were literally on the verge of collapse. And I think if anything was learned from that collaboration, collaboration between the military and the civilian world was really important. And I think that's really true today too. There are a handful of Israeli soldiers today who are refusing to go to Gaza. And there was just recently a 1,000, I believe, mostly pilots and retired Israeli pilots who wrote an article of protest against the war in Gaza for different reasons than some of the early protesters, individual protesters. But there is a small number of people, and the Russians too. There were over 200,000 people who led Russia at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. So I think collaboration between all of these groups are really important, and just as important today. Not writing off the military today, just, trying to work inside of that.
Mm.
Chris, I think
You're muted, Chris.
Yeah, Whit, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to echo the what Caroline and what Bill just said, the last thing you said about building across building a movement that could transcend different the differences, different barriers. Someone wrote in the Q&A there, that's in the anti-war movement there was so many different subsections in it. And so the pattern that I see in this so-called anti-war movement with an S is that, Americans had to feel that they have some stake in it. So that's the first thing. So someone mentioned that the anti-war movement was losing steam when the draft was abolished. It is true. It was so raw, it was so intense because there was a draft and Americans were being, dragged to Vietnam. And so somehow if we want to build a movement, I feel that, Americans we have to find a way to communicate, the stake, that we are all in it, or the majority of us are in it. And the other thing that I saw in the anti-Vietnam War movements was the somehow the Vietnam War became a kind of catch-all, movement for people of so many different, strata to come and just air their grievances. And that's why it was so large. I came across documents, abroad, outside, what I mean is outside of the country, in so many organizations, so many conferences, that there was a lot of differences and conflict among the participants, among different delegations. And when it came to Vietnam, people agreed. Vietnam became the thing that people could agree on and coalesce around. And so what I'm seeing in this country, in the US at the moment, is the diffusal of energy. I don't know if we will be able to unite it, but that it has to happen for a movement to take off and make a difference. Right now it's very diffused. That's what I think.
Thank you very much. We are coming down to our final 7 minutes or so. So I guess at this point, I'd like each of you to have the opportunity to just talk about any points that you feel like you wanted to make but didn't have an opportunity to make. It doesn't have to be a perfect summary, but it kind of be a sort of a round robin free-for-all at the end. And if you want to work in some anything about Daniel Ellsberg and his legacy, that would be appreciated too. Who wants to start? Penny, how about it?
Oh, I can't believe you called on me first. Well, I'm very interested in this last set of questions that we're talking about. Like, what are the lessons from, the movement of yesteryear to the movement today? And I guess I feel like I made these points, and others in this group made these points, but some of the lessons to me would be coming at our social movement activism with preconceived ideas about who is going to join the struggle, and why they may or may not join the struggle can hurt us, and that we should be approaching our neighbors and communities and coworkers, and ask questions and listen and learn about what kinds of grievances we all have, and the ways that we're experiencing the moment that we're in right now. Because I look at the Vietnam anti-war movement, and the most surprising people, it would seem so surprising, the people who came out and ended up opposing the war. And it seems surprising because you have preconceived notions about like who's going to be a protester and who's going to feel as powerfully, as Nguyet was just saying, like who is going to feel powerfully enough to actually partake in this movement. And I think we need to be coming towards each other in this moment with that kind of deep organizing to bring people into what I think are really existential struggles ahead of us, in the current political moment that we face.
Thanks, Penny. Bill, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I don't know what else to to say other than you just have to keep struggling. I'm 77 years old, and I've been doing this since I was 21. Um, you find organizations to work with, find good people that you can relate to, and you have to keep fighting. And especially today with the way things are going with the Trump administration, you you have to fight. If otherwise you're not going to have it, you're not going to have an America to live in. The somebody asked in the questions about the anti-war movement period after the draft, and I think immediately after after the war, 1975, I think a lot of vets were so burned out, so tired that they went into hibernation for a few years. But the U.S. involvement in Central America reignited a lot of veterans at the time, and there are moments in history when we do get reignited. And when you do get reignited, it's really important that you form relationships with other people, other groups, and you stay active and just keep voicing your opposition to the crap that goes on that tears this country apart.
Bill, thanks for that. I would just briefly mention that there is now at UMass in the Fine Arts Center a wonderful exhibit of campus activism in the 1980s around Central America, and shows you some of connects the dots from the 60s to the 80s.
I would come in, what are a few hundred things I didn't get to say? So one of them is I wanted to say something now about this period, and then connect to where we are right now. I think that if you think as an overview of the Nixon story, the most powerful and important effect the anti-war movement had, and it was there from the beginning, is that Nixon took the troops out. We always said it was a trick, it didn't count, it was too slow, whatever. The fact of the matter is he came in with 550,000 troops. By the time he is in the fall of 1972, he doesn't even have combat troops there. He has to have a peace agreement. And that actually, even though somehow or other anti-war people didn't exactly credit that, getting those troops home was really important. And that happened for many reasons, for a variety of protests, not the least of which, something we couldn't really talk about tonight, is Congress. And I remember back then that we all were mad at Congress because they had all these resolutions and they never passed. And what I think I learned in the archives is actually they didn't, but they didn't partly because Nixon kept taking the troops out. And Nixon had a description of this. He said, "I'm one step ahead of the sheriff." So all those non-resolutions and all these Republicans that went up to Capitol Hill and yelled at him, this actually, these troops didn't come out magically. It wasn't what they would have done absent opposition. It really isn't. But that this whole series of events really, forced the president to end the war. You could look at it the other way, which is, could this have been done faster? If the anti-war movement had had some different strategies, if we had made different choices, could this thing have come, not after 4 years, could it have come 2 years? I mean, that's a whole other challenge. But to me, the important lesson is that the activism led to a good result. And as we bring it to right now, I mean, we have two giant sets of things. I mean, one is the U.S., enabling of Israel to just be killing people in Gaza, which is itself a nightmare. And then there's all the things that are happening domestically, which are real damage to real people, as we're in that. And in both of those cases, and the domestic covers 20 issues, as Penny would notice, that in all these issues, we haven't really gotten started yet. I mean, I think Israel-Palestine, we've gotten started, and we need a lot more energy behind it. But I think that what is partly needed right now, and I'm not 100%, I see this on my campus, is hope. Is a belief that if you and your friends and the people get together and start thinking about what can work, that it actually can have a good result, even if you don't see it, at that particular moment. And when I look at what we're in right now, the need for organization, the need for political movement, activism is, as great as it's ever been.
Thanks, Rusty. Whit, final brief comment?
Yeah, I just have a brief thing to say about Daniel Ellsberg. Before his passing, he was a regular guest in my classroom, no matter how large or small my classroom was. He was such a personable person. He was a wonderful, individual. After my class, he always stopped and lingered to talk to me about different things. He would challenge me and try to teach me stuff, and he was scheduled to appear in my classroom in April that year, and we didn't have the honor to have him. So I'm very thankful for for you, Chris, and the organization to keep his legacy alive and going. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of you. This was a wonderful discussion. We didn't cover everything, but you covered a lot. So I'm very thankful. And just a quick reminder to tune in Thursday night, same time, for a great discussion of the legacies of the war in both Vietnam and the United States. So good night, everybody.
Nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
Night, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Nice
Bye-bye.
Caroline, may I write to you, or do I have your hang on, I want to see if I have your email. Oh, I got it. So I'm gonna write to you, Caroline.
Okay.
Very nice meeting
Yeah.
all of you.
Nice to meet you, Bill. Thank
Chris,
you.
thank you
Great.
so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bet.
Have a good day.
Thanks to Brennan. Yeah.
Steve, we should have lunch.